My book is titled The Burning Shores, The Battle for the New Libya. It's really the story of Libya's journey after its revolution. So it relates the narrative stories of a number of Libyan figures that were involved in Libya's development. It talks about U.S. policy after the revolution and also international policy. And it really tries to identify what went wrong. You have to go back to 2011, at the end of 2011, and recall the enormous optimism that a lot of Libyans had, that the international community had, about this country, that it was on the right track, that it was going to recover. You had elections in 2012 that were by many accounts transparent and successful. And then something happened. The country fell apart. It entered a period of civil war, economic decline, fragmentation. When people look at Libya today, it's often seen as an unintelligible mess, a bunch of militias. We don't often necessarily know who the major players are, what their interests are, what their motives are. And my book really tries to explain all that, for the lay reader, for the general reader. It also talks about the role of regional actors' interference in Libya and their effect on Libya's collapse. So there's a lot of accounts of the Egyptian, Qatari, Turkey, and Sudanese role in Libya's civil war. I think a main focus of the book is on U.S. policy. So I talk about the Obama administration's decision to intervene in 2011, and then especially what it did after the fall of Muammar Gaddafi. There was a great deal of reluctance by Obama to get involved in Libya, to be responsible for Libya's reconstruction, for its post-conflict recovery. The administration really wanted to cede a lot of that responsibility to the Europeans and to the United Nations. And there were enormous consequences from that reluctance to get involved. And we're seeing that today. So the book is meant to be sort of a one-stop shopping for Libya, for the general reader. It's meant to acquaint the reader with the major figures. It draws on interviews with the major players in Libya from all different factions. And I think it tries to dispel, a lot of the myths about Libya, about the militias, about Islamists, about what's really happening in the country today. This is a really fundamental question. Of course, right now in Libya, there is some nostalgia for the reign of the dictator, for all of his abuses, for all of his faults. People argue at least he provided stability. If you look at Libya today across the country, people are in desperate need of, just basic economic livelihood. They're not able to address their basic living needs. Libyans are actually starting to leave the country, or they've been leaving the country for quite some time, for medical care, for jobs. I think so. This desperation has given them a somewhat rosy-colored view of the rule of Muammar Gaddafi. And it's true that there was peace on the streets in the capital and the cities under his reign. But I would argue that beneath the surface, there was a lot of violence. There was a lot that was brewing beneath the surface. This is a ruler who had no qualms about killing his own population, whether it was during a rebellion and insurgency in the 1990s in the East, whether it was during a prison massacre in 1996. In some sense, he exported his problems abroad. He allowed jihadists to go abroad to foreign battlefields, and they later returned. So this is a real, I think, dilemma. I don't think it was better. I think you talk to many Libyans. This was their revolution. After the revolution, you found this sense of euphoria that suddenly people had a say in their own affairs. They were able to organize themselves politically. And of course, that didn't work out, and we've entered a period of disenchantment. That's normal in all revolutions. Revolutions take a very, very long time. And so what I really emphasize in my book is that the story is not over. I think it's too early to write off Libya. Things may get worse before they get better, but Libya's story is still being written. There's often this narrative that the NATO-led intervention somehow destroyed the Libyan state, and that's incorrect. The problem was there was really no state to begin with. I mean, this is a country that for 42 years was ruled at the behest of one man. He concentrated power, he personalized power, and meanwhile, he didn't allow any form of political life, any form of institutions, whether you're talking about political parties, trade unions, civil society, the military and police. They were all gutted. So Libya was really a hollow state. And so I think the fragmentation and the instability that we're seeing today is the byproduct of that 42 legacy. Now, that's not to say that Libya's disarray, its instability today, was preordained after the revolution. There were a number of key turning points and steps that were taken and opportunities that were missed after the revolution that created the chaos today. I think some of those had to do with the holding of parliamentary elections so soon after the conflict. And the literature on holding elections is very clear that when you have elections so soon after a conflict, there's a great risk of a return to conflict, especially when you've got multiple armed groups that haven't disarmed. And that's, I think, the second major problem is the proliferation of armed groups and militias. There was a decision by Libya's weak transitional government to start funding the militias from Libya's oil wealth, and that proved disastrous. That allowed the militias to mushroom, to expand, to align themselves with various political interest groups, with various towns, and I think that explains a lot of the violence that we're looking at today. The other major factors have to do with the distribution of oil wealth in the country. That hasn't been worked out. The enormous economic problems and corruption that arose after the revolution, but were also a product of Gaddafi. And I think another major factor that happened after the revolution was the intervention of regional states. Partly as a result of the U.S. being behind the scenes, regional Middle Eastern states intervened in Libya. They played a very cynical game of arming protagonists on the ground, of arming separate militias, of funding them, of interfering. And that proved hugely destabilizing, especially when we look at the eruption of civil war in 2014. There are a number of other grievances, of course, and problems that arose after the revolution. These have to do with one issue that affects many different Arab states, and that's the inclusion of political Islamists. It's also regional identity. Libya does not have the deep sectarian and ethnic divides of Iraq or Syria. Its population is small. It's about 6 million people. It's concentrated. But there are still real regional identities in Barca, in Cyrenaica, in the east, in the south, and in the west. There are some ethnic groups that have their own grievances as well, the Tebu and the Tuareg. And those, of course, surfaced after the revolution as well. Well, Libya, after a period of civil war, arrived at a UN-brokered unity agreement at the end of 2015 that was able to take power in Tripoli, that was endorsed by major international powers. The huge problem with that unity government was that its legitimacy was contested from the beginning. It's true that the factions signed on to that, but in some sense, there were armed groups that never really bought into this agreement, specifically groups that were loyal to the former military officer Khalifa Haftar in the east. And so this unity government in Tripoli remains divided, remains beset by a number of political problems and gridlock. It's unable to really provide services in the capital. It's quite weak. It's confined to a very narrow geographic base. So the priority for the international community is how do you bolster this government, but more importantly now under the new UN processes, how do you revise and enlarge that government with a new governing formula that may include new elections later this year. Beyond that, the major problems of Libya are the same problems that afflicted it since after the revolution, and that's how do you disarm and demobilize the armed groups? How do you build a new security sector, a new army, a new police? What's the structure of that army going to look like? Which armed groups are going to be part of it? Which are going to have to demobilize? The other major question is the devolution of power and economic authority to local levels, municipalities. A big problem under Gaddafi is that he concentrated power in the center, and that left local level actors feeling aggrieved. So the question now is how do you bolster municipal level authorities? The other major issue is the one I mentioned about the role of regional states that are still, I think, playing a very dangerous game of backing different factions in Libya. And the new dimension to all of this in the last year or so has been the role of Russia. Russia's influence in Libya is not as great as it is in Syria, but Russia is still playing a role as well. The U.S. Role in Libya, I think, has primarily been viewed through a counterterrorism lens. Under the Obama administration, it was a bit different. Obama, in his last year of office, really in his last term, I think really tried to do a reboot of U.S. policy and to try to be more engaged. He appointed a special envoy for Libya that was involved in a lot of the diplomatic negotiations for this unity government. The Obama administration spearheaded an effort to train a new Libyan army that ultimately fell apart. But with the arrival of the Trump administration, I think U.S. policy has fallen back on a very narrow framework of counterterrorism. It's true the U.S. is still backing the unity government. The U.S. is still involved diplomatically, but not with the same muscle that it was under Obama. So the result is that Libya's policies or the responsibility for Libya has fallen to the Europeans. And the European actors are divided. They each have their own agendas. The Italians are focused primarily on countering what they see as the challenge for migrants that are transiting Libya's territory into the Mediterranean and onto Italian soil. The French have their own agenda that's counterterrorism. And so this fragmented approach isn't working to the benefit of Libya. It allows different Libyan factions to play off foreign powers. It's opened the door for Russia. And so what I've argued in the book and before congressional testimonies is that the U.S. needs to be more engaged, not necessarily in a nation-building role, but diplomatically.